Good afternoon, everyone. How are y'all doing? Good, good, good. All right. So I'm going to now introduce our next speaker, Mr. John Torkelson. We will have a very interactive discussion. This discussion is designed to be interactive in the sense there are two mics in the room on each end. Throughout the discussion, should you have any questions on the topic he will be leading today, please go ahead and form a line or present yourself to the mic, and Mr. Torkelson here will go ahead and call you out when it's appropriate. That's how this engagement will occur. I know those that have been with us in the past, we have the questions towards the end, but this one is going to be during the engagement, and that's why it's a little longer than the future discussions that we have within the program. Alrighty, so I'm going to go ahead and pass it over and have
just pass it on to me. I don't know why they put the best presentation at the beginning. So if you'll do me a favor and just slowly leave after I'm done, okay? Thank you for having me. My name is John Torkelson. I'm the president of the Access Partnership. I'm also past president of the Accessibility Professional Association. And I have a little bit of housekeeping. Again, I like to do a very informal presentation style, and I figure that if you have questions, let's do it while I am in that topic. So either raise your hand or get to the microphone, and we'll take questions as we go along. I am going to be talking today about accessibility in the built environment. I am going to focus my presentation on the Fair Housing Act. I'm going to talk a little bit about the different codes and standards that apply to multifamily projects, and actually to almost any project at the beginning. I have a few disclaimers, of course. The lawyers make me say this. First of all, the information that I'm going to be giving you is my opinion, right? This is going to be, let me make sure this is the right one. Yes, I'm an accessibility consultant. I'm not a design professional. I'm not a lawyer. You are not to take my word as gospel, but I'm pretty smart. I know what I'm talking about. So it's fairly accurate, but I have to put this down. The presentation is based on verbal descriptions of the slides, and actually we're not giving this slideshow out. I'm going to show you where to find the handbook that I based this presentation on, and you can go get that. I'm going to show a lot of example photographs, and a lot of those are of my clients' projects, and so they don't want me sharing their projects, especially because a lot of them are violations. I liberally borrow, which means I stole, a presentation that's put together. It's the Fair Housing Act's accessibility requirements overview and upcoming training, which is prepared by the Design and Construction Resource Center as a part of the Fair Housing Accessibility First program funded by HUD. I owe them a lot of thanks. You can find it. I'll leave this up here. Oh, it's really small. But if you go to the HUD website, or if you go to Fair Housing Accessibility First, you can find the slideshow that I'm borrowed this from. But I do need to give them thanks and credit. And just so you know, the Fair Housing Accessibility First is a project that is funded by HUD to disseminate information on the Fair Housing Act. There it is, www.fairhousingfirst.org. All right, that's all of the legalese and all the paperwork that we got to get done. All right, so in addition, I am an expert in the ADA, Fair Housing Act, Section 504, UFAS, all of the accessibility requirements in the built environment. A typical project type that we'll have is a multifamily development. Here, this one is a privately funded multifamily development. A lot of times people are going to say, well, ADA has to apply, right? We use ADA, in terms of society, uses ADA like we use the word Kleenex or Band-Aid, right? Those are trade names to talk about facial tissue or bandages, right? But they don't necessarily cover everything. So when we talk about the ADA, a lot of times we're talking about accessibility. But there's a lot of different types of accessibility and a lot of different codes and standards that apply to a project. And so it is very important that we are very specific when talking about accessibility in the built environment in terms of, are we talking about the ADA, meaning the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design, Or are we talking about ADA in terms of the Fair Housing Act, in terms of other accessibility requirements? So, in a multifamily development, the ADA typically will apply, but the ADA applies to the places of public accommodation. And that is a term of art, which means the areas that are used by the general public, where the general public is invited in to the facility. Typically, that's the leasing office. Sometimes you'll have some retail. Sometimes you'll have some live-work units where somebody is running an establishment out of their apartment. Sometimes I've seen where a fitness facility is being used by a trainer, right? And they run a business out of that. And if that business is open to the general public and is not just for the residents, then that's an ADA obligation. And so it's important to understand that when we talk about the ADA, in terms of accessibility in the built environment, we're being very specific as to where the ADA applies on a project. So the pool area, unless you sell memberships to the general public, is not subject to the ADA. Pool area on the federal level is subject to the Fair Housing Act. So the federal requirement under the Fair Housing Act is that areas that are used by the residents and their guests are subject to the Fair Housing Act and need to comply with the accessibility requirements therein. On top of that, we have the local building code, right? So the local building official is going to have their requirements, which is a different document from what is in the ADA. It's a different document from what is in the Fair Housing Act. And so we have to apply those requirements, those codes, to the project as well. There's one here that I don't have in here that you guys most likely will have, and that is if the property or the project receives any kind of funding, public funding, or is a part of a housing program or another program of a city or a state entity, then on top of all three of these that we also have Section 504 obligation or a Title II obligation, which is going to bring another layer in. Now, I can already see the glass over your eyes. What I really want you guys to understand is that when we do a development in the built environment, it is very critical for those of us that are dealing with it, the architects, the accessibility consultants, the developers, to understand that we have multiple layers that apply, and that depending on each of those layers, we have to satisfy each one of those independently, and there may be requirements that are different depending on where we are. I'm going to talk a little bit about safe harbors. This is a little bit over your head, but a safe harbor essentially is a document that you can go to that gives you the requirements in writing, the scoping requirements, which tells you how many of what need to comply, and the technical requirements tells you how to make those elements compliant. So a safe harbor document, if you comply with the safe harbor document, then you have deemed to comply with those standards or those requirements, right? So the ADA has one safe harbor. So it's very easy. You don't have to choose. It's the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design, right? So when we're talking about ADA, Title III, Title II, we go to the 2010 ADA standards. There's one document. And it's pretty easy. The Fair Housing Act, on the other hand, they chose a different route. When Congress established this and HUD started working on the Fair Housing Act, they established a different route. Their idea here was to try to get the local building officials to help encourage, to help them enforce the Fair Housing Act. And so one of their mandates was to approve, to the greatest extent possible, the local building codes, to make sure that what's required by the local building official meets the requirements of the Fair Housing Act. Now, being an accessibility consultant, that has differing levels of success, but it's there. So instead of one document, we have 15 documents that you can use, and you can choose any one of those 15 and be deemed compliant with the Fair Housing Act. I highlighted a few of them. The top one is the Fair Housing Act Accessibility Guidelines. That was the first document that HUD put out for compliance with the Fair Housing Act, all right? It is considered the lowest bar, right? It is the bare minimum that you have to do in order to comply with the Fair Housing Act. As such, most of the time when we're doing litigation, we're going to the Fair Housing Act guidelines. Do I recommend that you use that? Heck no. They're really hard to understand and they're not really well written. Go to the Fair Housing Act Design Manual. If you go to that Fair Housing Act First website, or if you just type in Fair Housing Act Design Manual, there's a PDF that's available. Why do we use the design manual? Well, because they included a lot of pictures and a lot of diagrams and a lot of examples, and it's a lot more user-friendly, right? It's really good. The problem I have with the design manual is that it has all those examples, and then they expanded the scope of the Fair Housing Act a little bit. There's a few things in the design manual that are more restrictive requirements than are in the guidelines. But in general, design manual is the way to go in order to understand sort of the low bar of requirements for Fair Housing Act. The other two that I highlight are the International Building Code and the ANSI, or the A117. These are the ones that are adopted by local jurisdictions as their building codes, right? They use the International Building Code and the ANSI. The problem that HUD has is that the International Building Code cycle is every 3 years. So there's a new building code every 3 years that's put out for cities to adopt if they want to. And the A117, the ANSI, is a code cycle of every 5 years. And so they are constantly improving. I'm actually now a member of the A117 committee, and we are constantly trying to improve accessibility requirements, not necessarily make it more, but just make sure that what we have works, right? We're getting into alternate technology now, right? When the Fair Housing Act was written, there was no such thing as electric vehicle. Well, there were, but nobody was really using electric vehicles, so we didn't have electric vehicle charging stations. All right, so how do we make accessible electric vehicle charging stations? That's something that the A117 committee works on, right? And we keep developing those types of processes. The wheelchair technology has gotten a lot better, things like that. So, when we apply on our mythical project, we have to apply the ADA, which is going to apply to any public accommodation where the general public is invited in, the leasing office. That's got to be ADA compliant. Right, so we're going to apply that. It's one safe harbor, that's easy. We're going to do the building code, right? The city has a building code. There's typically one building code. That's going to be easy in terms of choices of what we have to choose or what we have to apply. But when we get to the Fair Housing Act, we get really diluted, and we've got about 15 choices here. As you go down the list here, you get more and more things that are put into these codes and standards. And generally, they become more restrictive. But the low bar is up here at the top. That's the Fair Housing Act guidelines. And then as we go along, we're trying to match up with the cities, but it becomes more restrictive. All right. The last thing to say about a safe harbor is HUD and DOJ will tell you that when complying with the Fair Housing Act, you must choose one of those 15 as your safe harbor. And then they go on to say that you cannot, what we call cherry pick, or you cannot deviate from that safe harbor. And what was important is the next sentence that they say is, you can't deviate and still enjoy safe harbor. There's nothing in the Fair Housing Act that says that you must follow a safe harbor. The safe harbors are there to provide designers and developers guidance on how to comply with the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act is simply a couple of pages. In terms of design and construction, it is simply a couple of pages in the law, and it just essentially says don't discriminate, and to provide certain basic levels of accessibility in the common use areas. Those need to be fully accessible. In the units, there are certain things that they put in there, these requirements that I'm going to talk about in a second, simply to allow for a person with a minor disability, maybe a mobility impairment, to be able to either use the facility much more easily. So you don't put the sink all the way in the corner, you put the sink over a little bit so that I can get next to it, right? Or so that they can modify their unit without a great expense. So these are very minor requirements here. Did I finish my thought here? Hold on, sorry. So you don't have to comply with the safe harbor. You can use one safe harbor in its entirety. You also have the ability to select and deviate from that safe harbor, but anytime that you leave safe harbor, you're now exposed legally, because then you have to defend that you've provided a facility that is accessible to and usable by an individual with a disability, okay? So anytime you deviate from the safe harbor, you can do that, but you're now outside safe harbor and you run the risk that you have to defend your position. Okay. Oh, here it is. So in the ADA, so there's certain things. The ADA, and this is the requirements from the Fair Housing Act, they basically say that you can deviate. You can use an equivalent facilitation. You can use alternate methods for complying. It's just that you are at risk. You have to defend. Usually that becomes a lawyer's decision. All right, why is it important that I just spent all that time? All right, so we look at a bathroom like this, right? For those of you that know accessibility, you can't build like this right now under the ADA. We have an obligation to have a 60-inch clearance behind the water closet before you put that lavatory. You need more space, right? So that picture in the upper left does not comply with the ADA. It doesn't comply with local code either. But when the Fair Housing Act was written, using the Fair Housing Act guidelines, they had, in effect at that time, was the 1986 version of the A117. And the 86 version of the A117 has the diagram that's in the upper right. And so the upper right diagram allowed for that lavatory as long as you had a 36-inch clearance. So if I am choosing a safe harbor, such as the guidelines, which uses the 86 ANSI, because that was the ANSI that was in effect at the time that Congress passed the law, which means that's what Congress thought accessibility was. If I look at this bathroom, I have to ask, is that bathroom serving the leasing office? Yes or no? Is that bathroom in a location where the local building code requires the 60 inches? Yes or no? Here in the city of Austin, the local building code would not allow it. But if we're in the city of Houston has deleted the accessibility requirements in the local code. So this bathroom, I couldn't do in Austin, but I could do in Houston if it is serving an area that is only used by residents and their guests. So if this is the pool area, that bathroom would be okay. So it's important to understand, for those of us that are nerds and wonks like I am, where is the project? What is the element serving? For you, it's important to understand that just because you saw it in one location and it may be good or bad, doesn't necessarily mean that that translates exactly to another project, right? We have to apply all of these different layers and understand all those different layers. Does that make sense? I think I've got some eyeballs that are saying absolutely yes, and some that are like, man, I don't deal with the built environment at all. I don't care. Okay, so good. So let's go back to the purpose of the Fair Housing Act. Fair Housing Act, the intent of the Fair Housing Act was to put modest accessibility requirements. So when we're talking about the Fair Housing Act, in the dwelling units, we're talking about accessibility light, right? We're talking about the mini-me to Dr. Evil. We're talking about a much lower bar within these dwelling units. And so when we talk about accessibility requirements in dwelling units, yes, we do have them, but don't try to apply what we have in the common areas in the dwelling units unless we're dealing with fully accessible dwelling units, okay? So one concept that gets lost on people is, all right, wait, I've got units that have to have accessibility requirements under the Fair Housing Act. Okay, well, I've got to make them fully accessible. I've got to make them look weird. And the answer was that Congress, their intent was not to do that, right? Was not to make it look unusual or to change significantly the way that we design and construct buildings, right? This is a compliant fair housing unit. Okay? It is intended to look very similar to what everybody else has, right? It is not intended to significantly change the way we design and construct buildings or multifamily projects. All right, so let's get back to the Fair Housing Act a little bit. Now, I want to make sure that I'm very clear that what I'm talking about here is the Fair Housing Act. And I am not talking, oh, we've got a question, good. Yeah. And I want to make sure I'm very clear that I'm talking about the Fair Housing Act. I am not talking about accessible dwelling units if you have an obligation under Section 504 or under Title II. Yes, ma'am?
Can you go back to that last slide?
I can. This one?
So we were commenting, that shower, what is the opening for that shower? Because you're saying it's compliant, but that doesn't look like if you needed to fit a wheelchair or something in there.
Oh, you're not. Yeah. You're definitely not going to fit a wheelchair there.
Compliant?
It is compliant with the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act simply requires a clear floor space adjacent to the bathing fixture. It does not require access into the bathing fixture. Now, all right, hold on. I know that it's laughable. You guys are with me, and this is where I started as well. What it does is it has the clearance there. So now if I'm a person with a disability, right, let's say that I have a mobility impairment, either I'm not going to choose this unit type, right, because it doesn't have what I need, or let's say that I become disabled as I'm there. Well, if I have a disability and then if I become disabled and this is my unit, then the Fair Housing Act requires that the owner allow me to modify my unit based on my disability at my cost under the Fair Housing Act. If I'm in a or if I'm in a 504 entity, it's at the owner's cost. But here, I would simply take that glass panel out, right? And modify that, then I have access to that bathing fixture, okay? And the owner has to allow me to do that. And then I have to return it back to the condition that I was put in. So that's a really good example of we're thinking about accessibility in a completely different way. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that should somebody have a need, they can modify it easily. They're not gonna have to rip out the entire bathroom. It's simply that glass panel and be able to get access to that bathing fixture. Yes, sir.
So, of course, you know we're Texas and we have to do things our way.
Of course we do.
You were talking about layers. I wanted to ask about the layer of the Texas Accessibility Standards.
Thank you very
and
much.
TDLR, the
Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation. So I am a registered accessibility specialist. I have been since 1997. And TDLR does apply to the project, and that is on top of the local, it is what we would consider a local code. The Texas Architectural Barriers Act applies to places of public accommodation only, so they are similar to the ADA. There is specific language in the law that excludes residential from the requirements of the Texas Architectural Barriers Act and TAS, the Texas Accessibility Standards. So Texas, while we do have TDLR and TAS, it's going to apply to the leasing office only, right? And so there's an obligation to submit for plan review and inspection, and this is where the City of Houston falls short, which is what I said. So City of Houston took Chapter 11, which is the accessibility requirements in the local building code, and they struck it, and they said, follow TAS, right? Which is great if it's a commercial facility or a place of public accommodation. It leaves a hole if you're a residential developer because there's no obligation under TAS for any kind of residential obligation. Okay, so again, the idea here is you can imagine that if the shower were there and you don't have a clear floor space, which is what's required, and the toilet's in the way of getting a clear floor space to that shower, then in order to modify that unit to be usable by a person with a disability would be a significantly larger change, right? We would have to move plumbing. We would either have to move the shower or move the toilet. So the idea is that we're dealing with clearances And those items that would be really expensive to change, but don't necessarily alter the character of the project, right? So you can see how the lavatory is pushed over a little bit, right? If that lavatory were stuck in the corner, it'd be really hard to get to, and to modify that cabinet would be difficult. All right, so Fair Housing Act, I'm gonna go back to the beginning. The Fair Housing Act was passed and it became effective for occupancy March 13th, 1991, right? So if the project was constructed prior to March 13th, 1991, you have no Fair Housing Act obligation, right? And then there's a design date in there. Also, the Fair Housing Act covers facilities where there are 4 or more dwelling units in a single structure, okay? And so if I have a duplex, a triplex, a single-family home, those aren't covered by the Fair Housing Act, right? It also excludes, so when we talk about dwelling units, we get into some granularity, but it includes dormitories, right? It includes apartment buildings. It includes congregate housing. It may include group homes. It may include housing that is provided for transients. I can't remember what is the name here. Homeless shelters, thank you. Assisted living, those kinds of things, right? So if it's considered a residence and you have 4 or more structures or entities together, then it is covered under the Fair Housing Act. When we have an elevator in the building, all units in that facility are covered, right? They're subject to the Fair Housing Act. If there is no elevator in the building, then it is only the ground floor units that we're looking at. So the units above aren't subject to the Fair Housing Act. We don't need to make those compliant. We don't have to provide an accessible route to those, right? We only have to provide the accessible route and make the ground floor units compliant when we don't have an elevator in the building. So we don't cover facilities that were owned or constructed and occupied prior to March 13th, 1991, single-family housing, duplexes, triplexes, or multi-story townhouses, okay? So there was somebody that whispered in a congressman's ear and said, hey, we can't make these accessible, right? And so they have excluded multi-story townhouses from coverage under the Fair Housing Act. There's actually a couple of different little exclusions. Now, one thing to understand is that a lot of times you'll see the townhouses, the multi-story townhouses all lined up in a row, right? And the question is if they are separated by a firewall and considered separate buildings under the building code, or if they are platted separately, are they not considered 4 units? And the answer is no, they're all still in a single structure. They're still subject to the Fair Housing Act. And then if we have a multi-story townhouse, but that townhouse has an elevator, either installed or planned, it is subject to compliance. And then if we have a townhouse that is a part of, and actually I think this previous slide here talks about it here, down lower left. Let's say we have a townhouse unit, which is a multi-story townhouse unit that is a part of a larger project where the building has an elevator, then the primary entry level of that townhouse is subject. So, I'm not expecting you guys to understand or remember all of that. What I do want you to understand is that the subject units are fairly simple, right? It's the ground floor units if you don't have an elevator. It's all units if you have an elevator. If you have a townhouse, then call me, okay? All right, let's see. All right, so let's get to the fun part here. So Congress essentially broke down the Fair Housing Act into 7 requirements, right? The first is an accessible entrance on an accessible route and accessible public and common use areas. Those are the common areas that are outside the dwelling unit itself, right? The next 5, usable doors, an accessible route into and through the dwelling unit, light switches, environmental controls, electrical outlets, thermostats, reinforced walls in bathrooms for the future installation of grab bars, and then usable kitchens and bathrooms. Those are all within the unit. And all of these requirements are generally less restrictive than what you have outside the unit. And I say generally. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on what an accessible route is. I think we all understand what that is, right? It's got to be level. You can't have steps along an accessible route. That kind of makes it inaccessible. We're going to be looking for protruding objects, slopes, things like that. We need to make sure that we have accessible parking that's provided. And the accessible route is required to connect our site arrival points, which is how you get to the site, which means typically the public right-of-way, our accessible parking spaces, passenger loading zone, or if we have a transportation stop, a bus stop, right? School bus comes to this place. That's a site arrival point. And you've got to get from there to the units, and then you get from the units to the common use areas, okay? Like this, okay? So we've got a public transportation stop, we've got parking, we've got to be able to get to the amenities. Now there is an exception that allows that if you have a site that has conditions that are extreme, right? You have a steep hill, you may be able to use a vehicular means of connecting between those 2 points. It is generally, I will tell you, very difficult to use that exception, even though it's in there. It is generally very difficult to use it. All right, so I got to be able to get to the street. I got to be able to get to the common use areas. Obviously, grass, unless it's the putting green at Augusta, right? Putting green at Augusta, I would say, yeah, that's probably an accessible surface. So I won't say grass is never allowed, but you don't want to do the maintenance on that, right? So we need to make sure we have sidewalks that connect things. Don't want steps. We've got to be able to get to the playground. Picnic table. They got to the playground here, they just forgot the picnic table. All right. Public and common use areas. If we provide elements that are provided or for the use of the residents and their guests, they need to be accessible. And here, generally, the requirements for accessibility are similar to what you're familiar with under the ADA, right? They need to be fully accessible, have controls that are within the reach range. I need clear floor spaces, need to be able to get to them. Obviously, the rental and management office is one. Model units, I got to be able to get to that. Mailboxes, swimming pools, tennis courts, clubhouses, garbage dumpsters, playgrounds, EV charging stations, resident storage, bike storage. Essentially, if there is an amenity that is being provided for the use of the residents, I got to have accessible ones of those, and I got to be able to get to them. Okay? Now, I will tell you a couple things. Playgrounds and swimming pools. Requirement under the Fair Housing Act, when we're using the guidelines, which is the lowest bar, my only obligation is get to the edge of them. I am not required to have accessible playgrounds under local building or under the Fair Housing Act. It may be a local building code requirement, or it may be a requirement if we have public funding, but the playground itself is not required to be accessible under the Fair Housing Act. Similarly, the pool. The pool is not required to be accessible. I'm not required to get into the pool under the Fair Housing Act. That would be either the local building code or if I have Section 504 funding. All right, accessible parking. So you, in the Fair Housing Act, you can see evidence of some of the negotiations here, right? And so instead of going to the table or the chart that talks about the number of parking spaces that are required under the ADA, Fair Housing Act only requires 2% of the parking that's provided to be accessible, and then it needs to be distributed throughout the site. So you can imagine a garden-style apartment where there's maybe 30 or 40 spaces for each one of those, right? You may have one space that's going to serve 4 buildings, right? Well, what happens if I've got a space in front of building 1 and I'm in building 4? Well, the Fair Housing Act says that the resident may make a request and the owner has to work with the resident in order to provide an accessible space or a space that works for their disability. It doesn't necessarily have to be an accessible space, but it is a space that is designated for that resident based on their disability. It may be that they have an impairment that requires a fully accessible space, an access aisle, a curb ramp, right? It may be I have a back problem and I can't walk very far, and so my accessible parking space just needs to be closer to my unit. and that just needs to be reserved for me, right? But this is one of the compromises in the Fair Housing Act. So the Fair Housing Act states that the owner must make a modification based on a resident's need in terms of parking, and the trade-off for that was to only require 2% of the parking spaces to be accessible. Now, if you're working with somebody that's doing that type of a space and an accommodation, make sure that the signage indicates that it is reserved for that individual resident and does not have the symbol of accessibility. Because if you just put a handicap sign there, anybody can park there and they will, right? If you just put a handicap sign there and you don't have a fully accessible parking space, including access aisle and curb ramps, et cetera, then you're opening yourself up to liability because you've indicated that that's an accessible parking space, and it's not. It's a space that accommodates that particular resident's need. Make sense? Oh, yes, ma'am.
Yes, I have a question.
By the way, you're one of the ones that lassoed me into this gig.
That's right.
Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry.
We knew you had the expertise. I have a question about the previous slide on the pool.
Yeah.
You said that a pool does not have to be accessible.
I only have to get to the edge of the water.
Okay.
I don't have to have a requirement for a pool lift or a inclined walk or any way into the water under the Fair Housing Act.
Okay. But if I have a lift, a chair lift, does it have to be in working order?
Yeah, technically, no, not under the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act there is not an if provided must comply requirement, right?
Okay.
Now, it makes sense that if you provide it, it makes sense that it work. But it is not something that I would, if somebody has a pool lifter there and they don't have the battery, right? I can't come in and say that's a violation of the Fair Housing Act, because the Fair Housing Act does not have an obligation for you to get into the water. Now, it may be an obligation depending on local code. It may be an obligation depending on if it's publicly funded, right? Then you're providing a program, and there you have an obligation, and that's how I would cite that, not under Fair Housing Act, though.
Okay. If I have a therapeutic need to use the pool, and I ask for a modification
Yes.
for a lift to be installed,
Yes.
then that would be.
Yes, that is an accommodation that would be required. So I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to dispense legal advice, and that gets into the legal advice part. I will tell you my experience, and my understanding is that that is an obligation of the owner to allow the resident to do that, right? So the owner doesn't have to. It's not prescribed like the accessible parking is, where the owner has to do that. The owner has to pay for the accessible parking. If a resident has a need, a lift into the pool, an automatic door, if the door is otherwise accessible, right, under the requirements of the Fair Housing Act, but they need an automatic door opener because they're not able to operate the door, that's the resident's responsibility to pay for. But the owner must allow for a modification in their policies and procedures, which includes allowing them to install that pool lift, as long as it's not a hazardous condition, essentially. Yes, ma'am.
So, Juanita Martinez, I've lassoed you.
Yes, you did as well. I didn't want to embarrass you.
So, pool, let's go back to the swimming pool.
Yes.
Okay, so we have a person with a disability who needs access to the pool.
Yes.
Who actually needs to use the hoist to get in the pool. They can't jump in from the edge. They
Sure.
can't dive in.
Right.
So if they have the hoist already available and it's not in working order.
That gets
there's
into
an
a more legal.
Are you telling me there's an obligation by the tenant to fix that?
Is this
hoist?
a publicly funded project? It's just privately funded
I
project?
don't remember. Was it? It was private.
Is private action? No. There is no there now. They can say, hey, look, I need this lift, and therefore I am going to help pay or have a policy that when I go to that pool, that is in place. And if they're required, let's say the pool lift is broken, then that may be the situation that the resident may choose to fix it. Now, it gets into really legal stuff that's way outside of what I normally do. So I don't want to get too far, but there the resident may pay to have it repaired, right? Or if they're just keeping the battery out of it so that people, kids don't mess with it, right? So they may alter their policy to be able to call in or somehow alert the management that, hey, I'm coming to the pool, can you put that battery in? Okay, So I'm done with pools. I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but as you can see, when I first started this, I had dinner with a friend of mine about 20 years ago. We were laughing that in 5 years we're going to be out of business because this is so easy. Yeah. All right. So accessible parking, we need to make sure that we're accessible. Can't have columns between the access aisle and the parking space here. We need to have a fully accessible one here, all right? So I talked about the distribution and the requirement, right? So this is the number of spaces that are required on a project like this. And so if we're down here in the far left, lower left building and I have a disability, you know, my nearest space is way over there in the middle or way up at the top. I can make a request. The owner is obligated to give me a space that meets my individual needs, right? Whether it's a fully accessible space or just one that has that's reserved for me close so that I don't have to walk as far because I have a heart condition or I have a bad back or something like that. Okay. That's the common use areas, right? So essentially, if you think about the common use areas, other than a few minor details, they're essentially the same as the ADA. I mean, essentially, accessibility is accessibility is accessibility. There's a few differences, but in the common use areas, we all sort of understand what accessibility is. In the units, we have those areas. So there's an interesting distinction here, and that is usable doors. You have an accessible door on the resident corridor side or the public side that is considered common use, and that needs to be fully accessible. Maneuvering clearances need to be level. I've got to have the space that's required. I need to have lever hardware. I can't have round hardware, things like that. Inside the unit, there's only a requirement for the width of the door, all right? And that is not the same width that we have in the common use areas. It's another sort of concession to the builders. And so instead of a 36-inch door, I'm able to go down to a 34-inch door, which gives me a 32-inch nominal clear width. Okay? And we measure the door clear width. We open the door in the 90-degree position. I'm going to measure from the stop of the door to the edge of the door in the 90-degree open position. I need 32 inches nominal, which is not 32 inches clear. It's essentially about 31 5/8, 31 3/4. A standard 210 door should give you the 32-inch nominal clear width. Where do we have a lot of problems? Usually we're okay in bedrooms, bathrooms. We get problems in shallow closets, right? When we've got a closet, and they're going to allow for the closet to be 2 feet deep inside to inside because that's standard for hanging clothes, right? But if you're deeper than 2 feet, then you're considered to require an accessible route through that door, and then that door width is subject to compliance. I need to have a compliant door. Bifold doors are the bane of my existence. We don't see a lot of them anymore, but bifold doors, it depends on the hardware and how all these things happen, but it has to have the same 32-inch nominal width. Bypass doors are similar, right? If I don't get 32-inch nominal when I open that door all the way up, then that closet can't be deeper than 24 inches. I talked a little bit about the hardware on the corridor side. There's no requirement for the hardware inside the dwelling unit to be accessible, and there's no requirement for the maneuvering clearances, which is the extra space at the doors that allow for a person with a mobility device to get through those doors. There's no requirement inside the unit for that. There is on the outside. Now, going back to the logic of the Fair Housing Act, it's fairly easy to change out the door hardware. We're not doing a lot of structural. It's not costing us a lot to change out door hardware. So the door hardware is not something that's important to us as we are inside the dwelling unit. Maneuvering clearances, well, we might be able to take a door off or to add a handle that is different than the normal handles to be able to allow us to operate that door. So when we're talking about doorways, it is on the corridor side or the public side that we have to have accessible hardware, maneuvering clearances, slopes, but not on the inside. The inside, the only requirement is that we have that nominal width at the doors, right? Sliding glass doors are one of the more interesting ones. Usually a 6-foot door will work. Sometimes, here's 30 3/4, right? That's not enough. Well, what's the problem? Oh, 31 inches. What's the problem? Well, sometimes you'll see that there's a manufacturer's installed stop that can be removed. If that's the case, then I'm not going to call that out. I'll take the stop out, see what I get, right, after I've removed the stop. Sometimes it's a piece of hardware, like this door pull here, that is keeping me from being able to open it. Right there, I would call out, and I've made them replace the door hardware because I can't get that clearance. Okay, so we've got usable doors. That's good. Now, I need an accessible route into and through the unit. Okay, and it's very specific as far as what's required through there. But essentially, this is where we have our changes in levels in our units, and being able to get through. It's our corridor width, our hallway width, things like that. I got to make sure my hallway is wide enough. 36 inches is the width of an accessible route, so I got to make sure I've got a wide enough hallway to get through there. And then changes in levels are really important to people like me, right? A standard change in level. Where do we have issues? Well, when we get tile, right? Tile is usually pretty thick. Now this one was designed, this was back before or right when the vinyl planks and the vinyl laminate got really good, right? And so this one was designed to have an engineered wood floor, right, which is typically about 3/4 of an inch, ½ inch to 3/4 of an inch thick. Now the vinyl laminate's like 1/8 of an inch thick. They swapped out the floor where the wood part looks, right, and didn't compensate for that when they put the tile in. And so they have a change in level that's a bust here. 3/4 of an inch change in level. Sometimes it's the transition strip that we're using. It's the product that we're using that's a very non-compliant condition. Sometimes, so if you're doing construction, we have stone thresholds, they can't be too thin or they break. So they have to be a certain thickness, and so you've got to float that floor up. Instead of bringing the stone down, you bring the floor up a little bit on the outside. Carpet transitions, right? There's a specific requirement for the transition to either be no more than 1/4 inch vertical, and anytime I go over 1/4 inch, it has to be up to 1/2 inch, but I have to have that 1 to 2 bevel, right? So it has to be a bevel. So a 1 to 2 or 1/2 inch quarter round, which is what we have here, if I draw that quarter round on top of the bevel, you can see that it's too steep at the very lower part of that quarter round. So I can't use a quarter round that's 1/2 inch. There are some allowances in the Fair Housing Act that don't show up in the local building code or under the ADA in terms of transitions at exterior conditions at the primary entry door. They allow you to have a 3/4 inch threshold and then a 1/2 inch change in level. So I might be able to comply with the Fair Housing Act and have up to 1 1.25 inches change in level. Has to have the bevel. But you can imagine a person with a mobility device, right, a wheelchair or a walker, trying to get over that 1.25 inch change in level. Not very good. But it is allowed under the Fair Housing Act. All right, we talked about all that stuff. Where do we have a lot of trouble is going out to the patios, right? So when we're talking about patio doors, the patio door has to be compliant on the inside, right? Which means I can't have a 1 inch vertical. It has to have that. At a sliding glass door, it allows up to a 3/4, or if it's a swinging door, it's a 1/2 inch threshold. Has the same bevel if I'm over 1/4 inch. Even at carpet. So what do? The Fair Housing Act doesn't require, let's say that here's a threshold that's a 1 inch change in level, I can use a ramp inside the unit under the Fair Housing Act. I can't under local code or ADA. I'm sorry, in a fully accessible condition, I can't under local code or ADA. I can inside a dwelling unit, right? So we just put a little ramp in there. Sometimes that ramp is underneath the carpet, all right? So this is a product called Carpet Shim, right? So you just put it under the carpet. Now, at the exterior side of the door going onto the balcony, on the outside, then when you have the door, it's an exterior door. Oh, I already talked about that one. Secondary door. There's a difference in the transition that's required from the inside finished floor to the exterior patio balcony, depending on whether you have a pervious construction or impervious construction. And what's the difference between pervious and impervious? Well, here's an impervious deck that essentially, imagine just pouring a glass of water right there at the edge of the door. And does the water travel down through the deck, or does it travel out to the edge? All right? And so this is a concession in terms of water infiltration into the unit. You can imagine that we get one of these nice thunderstorms, one of these gully washers, and it comes in and it's pushing a lot of rain, and it's wind-driven rain. And so this is an allowance that if that water is not going to go down and it's going to come up against that threshold, we're allowed to have up to a 4-inch change in level between the interior finished floor and the patio, right? That's impervious. If it is pervious, so here's an impervious one. If it's pervious, if that water's going to drain down, then it doesn't matter. That water's coming in and it's going to drain down, so it's not going to collect there and get into the unit. So now we have a 1/2-inch change in level, right? So we have to, if we have an impervious or a pervious surface like this, we have a difference here. Now, one of the things that I get a lot is when we have a condition such as this, where I have an impervious balcony, and I call out the threshold at the door, right? They're like, well, why are you calling out this threshold when I've got this 4-inch step going down into the balcony? And the answer is that I tell them, look, it's what Mama said, right? You got to do what Mama says, and we have to do what the Fair Housing Act is written. And this is one of those cases, much like the allowance to put grab bars in. We're not required to put grab bars in, we just have to have reinforcing. We have to do parking on request. So this is one of those concessions that the framers of the Fair Housing Act allowed because of water infiltration, and then the resident gets to choose and has to figure out and pay for whatever modification is needed for them to be able to use that patio. So this is one of those allowances that becomes an exception to the rule. Where is my timer? Where's my person with time? All right, I'm in good shape. Okay. So we're allowed to have up to a 4-inch change in level. And even though we have that 4-inch change in level on the outside, the inside threshold is still required to be accessible, even though it doesn't logically make sense. Okay. Light switches, electrical outlets, and thermostats. This is where I get a lot of my money, is because of outlets, right? Because it seems very simple to us, but it's very complicated. I'm still good, right? There's my teal jacket. Okay, got it.
Wait,
All
wait,
right.
don't go far. Threshold.
Oh, wait, there we go. I'm sorry, I'm not paying attention. I'm sleeping up here.
That's okay.
All
Just
right.
a quick question on
Yes.
that. If there's settling involved, is that an issue of construction and design, or is that just something that the building's gotten old and the owner needs to fix that? Or
Okay.
is it a fair housing violation? Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the question. That's a really good question. Anybody know? All right, so the answer to that is going to, I'm going to break it into 2 parts. The first is under the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act itself is a design and construction law, which the Congress, when they said you must design and construct the facility to be accessible. There is no ongoing maintenance of accessible feature obligation under the Fair Housing Act. And so in the Fair Housing Act, if it was designed and constructed to be accessible and it is settled, it is not a Fair Housing Act violation. Okay? Now, if you have a publicly funded project that is subject to Section 504, that has an ongoing obligation to maintain accessible features. The ADA, if that were along an accessible route under the ADA, you have an ongoing obligation to maintain accessible features under the ADA, but the ADA generally doesn't extend into dwelling units unless it's publicly funded. That make sense? Good. Whoops. All right, so there are certain elements that are listed. Do you have a question about thresholds or?
No, different questions, sir.
That's fine.
Yeah, I have two different questions. First, we know that not all disabled have physical disabilities.
Right?
For those, do they have to prove their disability in order to get the accommodation?
To get an accommodation under the Fair Housing Act, do they have to prove a disability? That's a legal question, and I don't know the full answer on that. So I'm going to punt that one. I believe that in general, there needs to be a reasonable expectation or understanding that the person has a disability. Yeah. Okay. Now this gets, and I will say this. We talked about the accommodation parking space, right? And so I've been I've done several lawsuits, and I did a developer in Florida, right? And we did 97 properties all throughout Florida. And you could tell that on some of the properties, there was maybe one accommodation space or not, but there were several of the properties where it was 18 in front of one building and 18 in front of the other building because somebody said, oh, if you just ask, then you get a reserved parking space. And that becomes a question of can you ask somebody and make them prove their disability? So that's a legal question that's well beyond my knowledge.
And second question, let's say the disabled person or the ADA person got his accommodations and it was a major complex accommodation or changes. Now at the term of the lease, and this person decide to leave, who is responsible for
Putting it back?
putting it back to the initial state?
Yeah. So under the Fair Housing Act, the obligation to return the unit into its original condition, as long as the modification is not something that, so let's say I take a 34-inch door and I make it a 36-inch door, and it looks just like the other doors, I don't have to go back and make it a 34-inch door again, right? But if I take out cabinets or otherwise modify the unit in a significant way, it's the resident's responsibility to return that unit into its original condition.
Thank you, sir.
All right, thank you. Good questions. All right. So the Fair Housing Act, this is where it becomes really expensive if you have to lower switches or raise outlets and things like that, because we're dealing with electricity. And it's fairly easy, knock on wood, to do it right the first time, right? It's not changing the way that we design. It's not changing the nature and use of the dwelling unit to make sure that the electrical outlets, that the switches, that the thermostats are within a certain reach range, right? Now, we don't cover controls on movable appliances. We don't cover stoves or microwaves or things like that. We don't cover the range hood, garbage disposals, special wall outlets. So I've got a refrigerator outlet that's behind the refrigerator. Obviously, that doesn't need to be in an accessible location. Really what we see now is the TV outlet that's up on the wall so that you can mount the TV on the wall. They didn't mount TVs on the wall back in the 80s, right, in the 70s. But now we do, and that's a special outlet, so that's not subject to compliance. Circuit panels, right, breaker panels are not subject under the Fair Housing Act. They are under local code. Okay, so the outlets or the breakers would be a local code requirement. Telephone and television jacks. Generally, if it's an outlet where you're going to, there's the low voltage box in a lot of these apartments where you go in and you bring in your AV equipment and your cable TV and all that stuff. That's not subject because you get that set up once and you leave it, right? We're generally looking for the outlets that are being controlled and operated frequently. So what are the requirements? Well, we're looking for a 15-inch low reach and then 48-inch high reach when I'm unobstructed, right? So if I've got a thermostat or a switch or a low outlet. They're going to be within that reach range. Be mindful. One of the places where we mess that up a lot is on the balconies, right? Sometimes those are too low. But in general, we're looking for a range of 15 inches to 48 inches, right? That's a little too high, and it's the operable part of the control. Thermostats, whatever I have to touch to operate that thermostat. So sometimes the make it hotter and make it colder buttons are within that 48-inch range, but there's a little button on top that's the light, right? That's a part of the operating controls of the thermostat. Or I flip a panel and I can program that thermostat. Well, that's a part of the thermostat. That needs to be within the reach range as well. Now, when I am reaching over an obstruction, right, like my kitchen countertop or my bathroom countertop, then I'd go down from 48 inches down to 46 inches. And this is one of the places where they're really specific about allowing for standard residential construction. And you can tell because they're allowing a 36-inch countertop height here, and they allow the cabinet depth or the countertop depth to be 25.5. And the reason that they allow that is that is standard residential construction for residential, right? So they're not trying to change the way that we design and construct residential construction. They're working within the parameters of what we normally have. And then it also says that you can have inaccessible outlets or controls as long as you have accessible ones that serve the same function in the same area. So sometimes, let's say that we have a really nice, high-rise penthouse, and it's got this window wall, and there's nowhere to put an outlet on that window wall, and so I've got floor outlets, but on the adjacent side walls, I have accessible outlets. That's okay. I can have those inaccessible outlets because I've got accessible outlets in the same area. When we're dealing with the kitchen, we would look at each section of countertop that has outlets as a different area. And here, I've got outlets that are both in the corner. I don't have a clear floor space adjacent, so I've got inaccessible control. Come here. Did I mess it up? I did. So let's go advance it one, please. All right, so here's a kitchen. I've got the outlets there in the corner. I can't reach that. All right, I don't have an accessible outlet in that area. I want to plug in a blender or something like that. I can't do it, right? So technically, I just need to get it outside that corner, right? So now I'm within a reach, right? So here, this is the geek in me showing you that I am outside the corner, okay? Now, even better would be to be outside where the protrusion of the refrigerator is. Is it required under the Fair Housing Act? It depends on who you ask. Different consultants have different opinion. That's a better condition, right? So we're out there. Even better is 36 inches minimum. And why do we use the 36-inch minimum? This diagram. And this is one of those instances. I told you about the Fair Housing Act Design Manual has a couple of instances that are more restrictive than the Fair Housing Act guidelines. So when we look at that, this requirement is one diagram only found in the Fair Housing Act Design Manual. But since the Design Manual has a lot of pictures and examples, a lot of consultants will use it as gospel, right? And so the best practice is to be 36 inches out. Is it required under the Fair Housing Act? I will tell you it depends on which safe harbor you're using. But if you're using any other safe harbor other than the Fair Housing Act Design Manual, that 36-inch minimum is not a requirement because it's only found there. All right, so I'm done with being nerdy. But outlets and corners are paying for my daughter to go to college. I'll just thank outlets. All right, so this is another thing that it's accessibility light. We don't have to install grab bars in the bathrooms, right? Even in an accessible dwelling unit, if I'm using the ADA, I don't have to install grab bars in the bathrooms. But I do have to make sure that I have reinforcing in the wall for the future installation of grab bars. It may be wood, it may be metal strapping, it may be within the fiberglass surround. If they're using fiberglass surrounds, I recommend that those be integral to the fiberglass. Yes, sir.
With the thermostat, you use on the one that you're using a mercury switch thermostat and stuff as your example for all these people to look at. And
Yes.
see. you can get a remote to these things and stuff, make it an accessible height, no matter what height it's at.
That's an interesting-
Is that an option?
So I just have, so in my opinion, this is my, and I'm actually writing this back to another accessibility consultant through a lawsuit. No. It is not technically compliant with the Fair Housing Act because the Fair Housing Act requires that the elements that are built be accessible. And that relies on a remote. Now, so what they're looking at a phone app, right? Not everybody has that phone app, right? So it may be that mama has it, but she goes to the grocery store and the kids or grandpa wants to change it and he doesn't have it. So I think that there is a legal position both ways.
So like a hand manual, like a TV remote.
Like a TV remote that just sort of stays there, yes.
Yeah.
I would be okay with that. Now, there are some times in common use kitchens where they'll do that for the microwave or for the vent hood. And I'm like, okay, as long as that's there and open and available at all times. But if it's a phone app, I have a little trouble with that because you're implying and expecting everybody to have the phone and that app and have it connected. So I have a little bit more difficulty with that. But generally, the Fair Housing Act is a design and construct requirement. And so if we do an alternate, we're stepping outside the safe harbor, we have legal risk. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I'm following you.
Yeah.
But also here. Like
And then
on the
sometimes
corner-
these damn remotes don't work. I'm sorry.
Naturally, but couldn't you have like a circuit switch here where it defaults to like a control that's at the plug essentially, where you built a plug next to a switch there where it's accessible, and so yes, it's installed to have that default switch there in the corner where it's again unreachable, but then you can actually have it in both locations.
Are you talking about the GFCI?
Yeah,
Yeah, GFCI we ignore, right? So it's like a breaker.
Yeah.
Breakers are not subject under the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act doesn't cover breakers. And so the GFCI, activation switch is technically a breaker.
Yep.
And so it's not subject to the Fair Housing Act.
But so is it a workaround for this issue where you wouldn't have to go and replace this whole circuit and stuff and pull the wall out
Yeah.
and all that?
Generally, the first thing to do is to do it right in the beginning. If you don't do it right in the beginning, ultimately what we do is we put a countertop extension, a power strip, right?
Yeah.
Now, the A117 committee, we had a subcommittee specifically on this, right? And
Yeah.
the research shows that even if we have the outlet in the accessible location, it's not usable by 50% of folks with disabilities. And so even though we do comply with this, and so we've come up with a whole different language that's going to come out in the next cycle of the A117, but it's not going to be safe harbored under the Fair Housing Act. So if you want to use that, you'd have to go from your safe harbor, go outside your safe harbor with legal risk, and point to the latest and greatest, which means that you have risk. You have legal risk.
So the electrical code could literally put the switch like right underneath the countertop or accessible so that, again, not water spillage on it, but,
Yep.
that's a possibility.
It is a possibility. Actually, the electric code is now is now going to not allow you to put outlets in the front of the base cabinets. And the reason is because think of a rice cooker,
Yeah.
right? You've got a rice cooker and you got a cord, and you're in a mobility device that gets hooked on your handle and you don't know about it, and it pulls the rice cooker into your lap or onto a child or something like that. It's a huge safety hazard. And if we were in California, there's a lot of folks in California that are doing that because of the way that they tweaked their requirements under the state of California building code. Yeah. All right, good. So the reinforcing in the walls is a simple thing. We just got to have the reinforcing, and it's actually, when you look at the Fair Housing Act, where that reinforcing needs to be, it's in a very limited area, right? It's not where you would have to install the grab bars if you were in a public or common use area. Now, local code does require you to have the reinforcing to be able to install the grab bars where there's a wall space. All right, kitchens. All right, so now we get to the meat of it, kitchens and bathrooms. All right, 3 general requirements. You have to have a 30 by 48 inch clear floor space. That's sort of a universal clear floor space for a wheelchair, or it used to be. The new 2017 version of the A117 has increased that space that's required by a wheelchair to 30 inches by 52 inches, right? And so that is larger, but it doesn't apply here. But it's one of those things that demonstrates that the A117 committee continues to do research, make sure that the elements are usable. It's larger because more people are using scooters, right, as a mobility device. Within the Fair Housing Act, we're generally talking about a 30 by 48 inch clear floor space. We need 40 inches of clearance in our kitchen, right, between opposing elements. And then if we have a U-shaped kitchen, which has elements on 3 sides, 3 contiguous sides, then we need a turning space inside that kitchen. All right, so I need 40 inches here. I need a clear floor space at each of my fixtures and appliances, and then I need 40 inches clearance. I need 40 inches clearance. I need 40 inches clearance, but here, I need the 40 inches between the range and the countertop that's opposite. It is a perpendicular clearance that we're looking for. The 40-inch clearance for the refrigerator extends into the place where the cameraman, me, is standing, right? So the 40-inch clearance for the refrigerator actually extends past the island. It's not overlapping the island. Now, the 40-inch clearance is required in kitchens. I've got a closet here at the end of my island, right? Is that closet, am I required to have 40 inches there? Well, the answer is that a part of the kitchen or not? If that closet were a laundry room or a coat closet, I would say no. It's not required to have the 40-inch clearance there because that's not part of the kitchen. But since this is a pantry is logically a part of the kitchen, so I would require 40-inch clearance there. And then when I have a U-shaped kitchen, three contiguous sides, I need to have a 60-inch turning space in there as well. Local building code requires 60 inches clear between all opposing elements. Now, I need that 30 by 40 inch clear floor space at my range, cooktops, sinks. 2 of those elements, the sink and the range or the cooktop, that 30 by 48 inch clear floor space needs to be centered. And you can imagine why. It's because when you're working at a cooktop or a sink, you need to be right there next to it and able to operate that element pretty much centered on that element. When we talk about other appliances like refrigerators, dishwashers, those have doors that swing out, and so you have to offset yourself from that clear floor space. And so the requirement to center on that appliance doesn't make logical sense. It is technically a requirement if we look in the Fair Housing Act Design Manual. If we look in the Fair Housing Act Guidelines, it's questionable. There's a lot of litigation out there, of course, which keeps me busy as to whether or not that is required. When we go to the newest versions of the A117, which is local building code, they allow you to offset that clear floor space from the center. Go to the microphone. Yellow. I got 10 minutes. 10 minutes to before my 30-minute questions, or 10 minutes. Oh, you're going to wrap me up. Uh-oh. All right, we got 10 minutes.
So what happens in the case if there's a range and you have an oven out there, so you have to open that oven down. So do you need to have space between the range and the sink?
Okay.
The counter of the sink?
Yeah, no, you're not required to. Technically, this is all you're required to have, right? You can be centered on the range and cooktop, and you're compliant. Oh, yes, ma'am, I'm sorry. I only have 10, no, I'm good. Okay.
I understand that you're here to talk about the accessibility part of the Fair Housing Act.
Yes.
Do you have any knowledge, since it was written 56 years ago, do you have any knowledge of any work that's going on now to upgrade that act?
All right. That's a good one. So the answer is yes and no. There is a push, and there always has been a push to take, after 50 years of the Fair Housing Act, to take that information and distill it and go back to one safe harbor, right? And to just adopt one of the newer versions of the A117 and the International Building Code. there's been talk about that for 20, 30 years. So the answer is, yes, there is talk. I'm not sure how successful it's going to be on the Fair Housing Act side, right? So all of the other codes and standards that gets applied to a project, there's still just one safe harbor. But the only one where we have these ambiguity and these choices is the Fair Housing Act, and it's the way that it was written in the law. And my suspicion is that it would have to be a change in law, and as we know, that's interesting to get Congress to work on that kind of thing. Then that's no commentary, just fact. All right, so I've got a sink. The sink, generally we want to have a clear floor space that is centered on the sink, right? Either a parallel or a forward approach. This guy here doesn't have a forward or a parallel approach because I've got 48 inches. I need to be 24 inches clear on each side. I'm only 20 inches, so I am not centered on that sink. Right? What I could do, removable base that allows me to roll up under. It can either be really, fancy and clear like this kind of a removable base, or it can be something that you have to unscrew a couple screws and you can pull the base out. Generally, what we want is that when you pull that base out, it all is finished, right? The flooring extends underneath, the walls are completed and look finished as well. On the range or a cooktop, I need a 30 by 48 inch clear floor space centered on there. Well, clearly I don't have the parallel approach on the right-hand side. This is one of those things where the cabinet guy, the architect drew it right. The cabinet guy says, well, look, you're putting two 9-inch modules on each side. That's not usable. I'm going to save you, you're going to thank me later. I'm just going to give you an 18-inch cabinet on the left side, and he messed them up. All right? Now, while there is debate whether or not having another appliance obstruct a clear floor space, it is best practice to make sure that your clear floor space is not obstructed by this huge refrigerator. All right, that's kitchens. Anything in any kitchens? You guys are an easy crowd. Bathrooms, okay? So, all bathrooms need to be, so this is in a dwelling unit, if you've got one or multiple bathrooms, all of them have to be on an accessible route, have to have that 32-inch nominal clear width at the door, have to have receptacles and outlets, have to have the reinforcing around the bathtubs and the toilets. There are two different ways, and this is a compromise between home builders and advocates that want fully accessible facilities. There's two different ways to design a unit, and so they came up with a compromise, right? Oh, I'm going to talk about clearances first. When you have a water closet that is subject, we have minimum requirements. You can have lavatories in here, so it is not fully accessible like you would have in a common use area. It is fair housing accessible. There's different clearances depending on the approach on the water closet. So this looks really, 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 really small, but it is compliant under the Fair Housing Act. All right? This looks really, really, really small, but it is compliant under the Fair Housing Act. As far as the water closets. Lavatories has the same requirement as a sink. I do a parallel approach, I need to be centered, or I can do a forward approach. Okay, now, there is some debate. So from the center line of the lavatory over to that side wall, I don't have 24 inches. And that side wall, the lavatory is recessed back from the edge of that side wall, right? And so I can't slide by. And so the question is, how much space? So this one, much better. But in order to construct this, I still have to have some wall there. So how much space will we allow for there to be an allowance to slide that clear floor space by? And it's not written anywhere. Generally, the folks that I know and respect will allow for up to an inch within that. You could be recessed up to an inch to allow you to die that countertop and still slide the clear floor space by. Right? Or we can do a forward approach. Right here, I don't have the space for a parallel approach, but I'm doing a forward approach. I've got removable base, so I can do a forward approach up underneath there, and I don't need 24 inches, I just need 15 inches. I need clearance at the bathing fixture. There's two different ways to design a bathtub. One is a perpendicular approach like this. The other is a parallel approach like that, where you have nothing obstructing next to the lab or next to the tub, okay? When I get to a shower, I don't have the same option of perpendicular or parallel approach on a shower. I have to do a parallel approach. All right, now let's get to the meat of that. So I've got differing clearances on the fixtures within my bathrooms. There's two ways to design a unit. One is specification A. Specification A was the builders, right? And what they say is we want all fixtures in all bathrooms to be compliant, but that perpendicular approach to the bathtub is permitted. And I don't have any requirement for the height of the lavatory. I can do a 36-inch countertop. We had, back in, 2000s, they started doing these vessels, right? That would stick up from the countertop, and they were like 42 inches. Well, that's okay under the Fair Housing Act, right? As long as it's a specification A, which has a lower bar, but it's all fixtures in all bathrooms. Now, the advocates who want everything to be fully accessible, makes sense. So what they said is, okay, look, what we'll do is we'll just do one of each fixture type in one bathroom. So instead of doing all fixtures in all bathroom, I'm gonna have a water closet, a lavatory, and a bathing fixture in one bathroom that meets the requirements. And what all we're asking for is 2 additional requirements. The first one is that at the bathing fixture, you have the parallel approach. So if you have a shower, it has to have the parallel approach anyway, but if I'm doing a bathtub, it's the one that doesn't have the water closet next to it. So I can pull up next to it and make a transfer in the tub without having to transfer through the water closet, okay? So the first concession is in a specification B bathroom, in order to use one of each fixture type in one bathroom, I have to have the clearance at the bathing fixture for a parallel approach. And then the second concession is a 34-inch countertop or rim, whichever is higher. So when we're walking through units, when I'm talking to designers and contractors mostly, a lot of times they say, oh, I only have to do one bathroom, right? And the answer is maybe, right? It depends on the design of the unit. There are many cases where we can do just one bathroom, but there's a lot of cases where the bathroom is not designed, one bathroom is not designed to meet that criteria for specification B, so I have to do all fixtures in all bathrooms. And so I would look at both bathrooms in terms of the fixture clearances. Does that make sense? I don't know why I put this at the end. Everybody's yawning, and lunch was good, and I told you, sneak out slowly. So this particular unit here, this could be a specification A bathroom if all of the fixtures have the clearances. But you see this shower that's right here? That shower doesn't comply. So I can't do a specification A bathroom. Then I'm gonna look, can I do the specification B? Well, I've got the bathtub that's hiding up there. I've got the clearance there. I don't have the toilet next to it or another obstruction next to that bathtub. So as long as the countertop at the lavatory is 34 inches, then I don't have to mess with this shower. I can have a non-compliant shower and I can use the other fixtures. And I'm almost done. I won't bore you too much, but ultimately, when we're looking at and we're doing an assessment or an analysis of a unit, we're going to start with specification A, and then we wait until we find a fixture that doesn't comply, and then we'll go to specification B because of the additional requirements. Powder rooms, we don't look at powder rooms. There's only one time. They still have to meet all those other criteria in terms of the door width and the outlets and they don't have to actually have the reinforcing. But the only time that we look at powder rooms is if they are the only toileting facility on the subject floor, on the primary entry level of a multi-story townhome in an elevated building. I'm gonna quiz you guys on that later. So it's very rare. Wait. All right, I got 2 more seconds here. All right, dimensional tolerances. I've got 5 more seconds. I got 5 minutes. Oh, easy, good. Because this is the fun part. the standards are written in a way where, they say, look, you've got 34 inches maximum to the countertop height. You've got a 2% maximum cross slope. You've got a toilet that's got to be 18 inches or 16 to 18 inches, depending on which version we're using, right? Construction is not an exact science. We all know that, right? Any of those that have worked in the field know that you do your best, right? So there is an allowance. Under the ADA, it's very well spelled out in terms of construction tolerances. When we're using the Fair Housing Act, there is no language that talks about construction tolerances within the safe harbors. But it sort of becomes a deviation from the safe harbor, so we have to defend it, which we have to defend dimensional tolerances anyway. In general, you may allow dimensional tolerances to construction projects when the requirement is expressed as a range. For example, the toilet needs to be 16 to 18 inches off the sidewall. That's a range. They're giving you the tolerance already. So 18 1/8 is non-compliant. You must be within that range. When it's expressed as an absolute, for example, 18 inches to the toilet center line under local building code, right? And for a Fair Housing Act toilet, it says 18 inches, right? I'm allowed to have a dimensional tolerance, right? And everybody says, oh, well, what is that, right? Well, hold on. When it's expressed as a minimum or a maximum, right? So 15 inches minimum to the floor, 2% maximum cross slope, you may also apply dimensional tolerances. And so people ask me, what is that dimensional tolerance? And the answer is, it's not written clearly. Ultimately, what it comes down to is each industry trade organization's tolerances. And so there is not an answer that I can give you. What we do is there's a book by David Kent Ballast. It's called Handbook on Dimensional Tolerances, 2nd edition. And he goes through and he has collected all of the different dimensional tolerances for all of the different industries. And so when I'm talking about a toilet center line, I'm looking at the allowable tolerance from the plumber. I'm allowing for the tolerance for the drywall, the tolerance for the tile, the tolerance for the wall. The important concept is not to give you what the tolerance is. The important concept is to understand that there are allowances for tolerances, except when the dimension is expressed as a range. If it's expressed as a range, they've given you the tolerance. You get nothing, right? And then that, I think, is it. I am a past president and founding member of the Accessibility Professionals Association. We're a group of folks. If this at all interested you, I recommend that you reach out to me. I'd be happy to talk to you about our organization. We're a group of folks that are nerds and wonks like me about accessibility in the built environment. There's some information there. And just watch out for alligators, right? Any other questions out there? Now, you guys remember, leave slowly. Don't make it look like everybody's leaving all at the same time, okay? All right, you guys have been great. Thank you.